was refilling my coffee when I heard my father say my name through the kitchen wall, and something in his tone made me stop. Not the usual tone. Not the usual tone, "S caddy once seen the car keys," or "tell your sister dinner's ready" tone. This was quieter, deliberate, the kind of voice people use when they think no one's listening. I stood in the hallway with my mug halfway to my mouth. "She's not getting the restaurant," he said. "Not a single location. We've already handled the paperwork." My stepmother's voice, smooth as always. "She'll figure it out eventually. By then it'll be too late to contest anything. And if she asks about the accounting, then she asks. She doesn't have access to the business accounts, never has." I backed away from the door before they could hear the floorboard creak under my foot. My hands were steady. I don't know why I remember that so clearly. That my hands didn't shake. My chest felt like someone had pressed a fist against it from the inside, but my hands were perfectly still. I'd been living in my father's house for 8 months. After my divorce and the cross-country move that followed, he'd offered me the guest room while I got back on my feet. I worked 32 hours a week managing inventory and vendor contracts for Callaway Kitchen, the family restaurant group my grandfather had built from one diner in 1987 into 4 locations across 2 counties. I'd been doing it for 6 years. I knew every supplier by name, every lease renewal date, every health inspection cycle. I'd renegotiated our food distributor contract 2 years ago and saved us over $40,000 annually. My father had hugged me when I told him. Called me the backbone of the operation. That was before he married Nadine. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, the room with the nautical stripe wallpaper that had always been the guest room, never my room, because I'd grown up in my mother's house across town. I was my father's daughter from his first marriage. Nadine's daughter Vivian was 23, fresh out of college, and had been given the title of assistant general manager at our flagship location 6 months after the wedding. I opened my laptop. I told myself I was just going to check email, but what I actually did was pull up the business entity filings for Callaway Kitchen LLC on the state database. My name wasn't listed anywhere. I'd known that, technically. I was an employee, not an owner. But my grandfather's will, which I'd seen, which I remembered, had included language about the restaurant group being held in trust for my son Gerald's children to be distributed equitably upon Gerald's retirement or incapacitation. My father was Gerald. I was his child. Plural. Children. I requested copies of the trust documents through the county probate court online portal that night. It would take 3 to 5 business days. I set a reminder and went to sleep. The next morning, I drove to the flagship location an hour before my shift and asked our bookkeeper, a woman named Rosie who'd been with us for 11 years, if she could pull the vendor payment history for the last 18 months. I told her I was auditing the produce contracts. She didn't question it. She handed me a printed report and went back to her crossword. I sat in the break room with a cup of coffee and went through it line by line. 30 minutes in, I found it. A vendor called Sunrise Fresh Supply had been receiving payments of between $4,000 and $9,000 per month for the past 14 months. I didn't recognize the name. We had 3 produce suppliers. I'd personally negotiated all 3 contracts, and none of them were called Sunrise Fresh Supply. I looked up the business license. It had been registered 11 months ago. The registered agent was listed as NKC Consulting Group. I looked that up too. NKC Consulting Group had been registered 14 months ago, 2 weeks after my father's wedding. The registered agent for NKC was Nadine Callaway, formerly Nadine Kessler. I photographed everything with my phone and put the papers back on Rosie's desk. I didn't say anything. I drove home, made dinner, sat across from my father and Nadine at the kitchen table and asked how their day was. My father said the lunch rush at the downtown location had been slower than usual. Nadine said she'd found a great new florist for the event space. Vivian showed up halfway through and helped herself to the pasta without sitting down. I watched all of them and thought about the $48,000 in fraudulent vendor payments I'd just found. That night I called my college friend Brennan, who'd gone to law school and now worked in business litigation. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment. How solid is the documentation? He asked. Printed bank records, vendor registration filings, and a business entity linked directly to your stepmother. That's not nothing, he said. That's potentially wire fraud, depending on how the payments were structured. Has anything crossed state lines? I checked. 2 of the 4 locations were in a different county. The corporate banking was through a regional bank with branches in 3 states. I told him. Okay, Brennan said. Before you do anything else, you need to understand your legal standing. You're an employee, not an owner. What does the trust document say? I'm waiting on the copy. Get it. That's her foundation. If the trust says what you think it says, then you have grounds to petition as a beneficiary. But you need that document in hand before you make any moves. I asked him what I was allowed to do in the meantime. Document everything, he said. Don't confront anyone. Don't let on that you know. And Lucy, be careful. People do stupid things when they think they're about to lose money. My name isn't Lucy, but I understood what he meant. The trust documents arrived on a Wednesday. I picked them up from the probate court in person. My grandfather had been thorough. The language was unambiguous. Upon Gerald Calloway's retirement, the restaurant group was to be divided equally between Gerald's children. There was no qualifier about biological versus adopted, no carve-out for stepchildren who hadn't been born yet. Just Gerald's children, full stop. At the time of drafting, that meant me and my older half-brother Owen, who lived in Portland and had never had any interest in the business. Nadine's name wasn't in the document. Vivian's name wasn't in the document. They had no legal claim to anything under the trust. I scanned every page and sent them to Brennan. He called me 20 minutes later. Your grandfather wrote this well. Has your father formally announced his retirement? Not publicly, but I heard him tell Nadine last month that he wanted to step back by the end of the year. If he retires without transferring ownership according to the trust, that's a breach of fiduciary duty. Add that to the vendor payments and you've got a case. He paused. How are you positioned right now? Are you still working there? Every day. Good. Don't quit. Don't do anything that looks like you're distancing yourself. I'm going to refer you to someone, a colleague of mine named Petra, who specializes in trust litigation. She's excellent. She'll want to see everything you have. I met with Petra the following Friday at her office downtown. She had the kind of focused attention that made you feel like the only person in the building. She went through my documents without speaking for a long time. This is strong, she said finally. The fraudulent vendor payments compound the trust issue significantly. Together, this isn't just a family disagreement. This is a legal pattern that a judge will take seriously. She set down the papers. I want to be honest with you about what comes next. This will almost certainly destroy your relationship with your father. There's no version of this that ends with everyone at the same Thanksgiving table. I know, I said. Are you sure? I thought about standing in that hallway, his voice deliberate and quiet. She's not getting the restaurant, not a single location. He already made that choice, I said. I'm just responding to it. Petra nodded once, like that was the right answer. We moved carefully over the next 3 weeks. Petra filed a formal notice of beneficiary interest with the probate court, which meant my father's attorney received official notification that I was asserting my rights under my grandfather's trust. At the same time, Brennan connected us with a forensic accountant named Dale who specialized in small business fraud cases. I gave Dale access to every financial document I'd been quietly copying and organizing since the night I'd heard my father's voice through the wall. Dale found more. The vendor payments were just the start. There were inflated equipment leases, commercial refrigeration units supposedly rented from a company that, on paper, had no physical address and no verifiable employees. There were payroll entries for 2 part-time staff members at the downtown location who, when I quietly cross-referenced with the actual scheduling system I managed, had never worked a single shift. $83,000 over 14 months, funneled out of a restaurant group my grandfather had spent 40 years building. The day my father called me into his office, a small room off the back kitchen at the flagship location, I already knew what he was going to say. He'd received Petra's notice. His own attorney had called him that morning. He sat behind the desk my grandfather had used. There was a photo on the shelf behind him, my grandfather in a white apron, arm around a much younger version of my father, both of them laughing in front of the original diner on its opening day. I'd seen that photo my entire life. "I think we need to talk about this lawsuit," my father said. "It's not a lawsuit, it's a beneficiary notice, it's what the trust requires." "Lucy." "That's not my name," I said. I don't know why I said it, it just came out. He blinked. He looked older than I remembered him looking, and I'd seen him 2 days ago. "You're making this into something it doesn't need to be. The trust says the restaurant group gets divided equally between your children when you retire. You were going to retire without doing that. Were you planning to tell me? You would have been taken care of." "By whom?" "Nadine, the woman who's been billing $83,000 in fake vendor payments through a company registered in her name." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. He didn't deny it. That was the part I kept coming back to after. He didn't deny it. He said, "That's a serious accusation. I have the bank records, the vendor registrations, the business entity filings, and a forensic accounting report. Dale Kemp prepared it. You can see his credentials on the cover page if you'd like." My father put his hands flat on the desk. He looked at them, not at me. "We can resolve this quietly." I don't want a quiet resolution. I want the trust honored. My brother Owen's attorney has also been notified. I watched his head come up sharply at that and kept going, and he's in agreement that the trust should be honored as written. He's not interested in the operations, but he is interested in his legal rights. I left before he could answer. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes. The lunch prep crew was arriving through the side entrance, guys I'd known for years, unloading from the produce truck. Miguel had worked the morning kitchen at this location since before I was doing vendor contracts. His wife was pregnant with their second kid. He'd told me last week, and I'd been genuinely happy for him. That was the part nobody else saw. The people who would be caught in the middle of whatever came next. The employees who'd shown up every day for jobs that were quietly being hollowed out from under them. I called Petra and told her what had happened. "He didn't deny the payments?" she asked. "No." "That's significant. We move forward." I moved out of my father's house that weekend. A coworker named Jonah, who managed our catering division, helped me load my car. He didn't ask questions. He'd worked for Callaway Kitchen for 9 years and was sharp enough to understand that something was changing. "Whatever happens," he said, carrying a box to my trunk, "this place wouldn't have made it through COVID without the vendor renegotiations you did. I want you to know I know that." I thanked him. "People talk," he said. "The kitchen crew, the floor staff, they see who actually shows up. They see who knows their names." I thought about that the whole drive to my new apartment. 2 days later, Nadine called me. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice was composed in a way that felt rehearsed. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "Your father and I were always going to include you. There was never any intention to cut you out. The paperwork was just in process." "The trust document requires equal distribution," I said. "That's not paperwork in process. That's a legal obligation." "Your grandfather wrote that a long time ago. Circumstances change. Families grow." "Families don't supersede trusts. My attorney has advised me of that." A pause. Her voice dropped slightly. "You're going to cost yourself your relationship with your father over this?" "He cost himself that," I said. "When I heard him tell you I wasn't getting anything." Another pause. Longer. "He didn't know you heard that." "I know," I said. "That's rather the point." I hung up. The formal mediation happened 6 weeks later. My father arrived with Nadine and their attorney, a man named Fletcher Grange who specialized in small business disputes and had apparently represented my father for years. Petra was next to me. Owen had sent a written statement since he couldn't fly in, but his position was clear and legally documented. The fraudulent vendor payments were on the table within 20 minutes. Grange tried to characterize them as accounting irregularities. Petra put Dale's report in front of the mediator page by page and walked through each payment, each shell company, each employee who'd never existed. Nadine didn't look at me once during the entire session. My father looked at me twice. The first time was when Dale's report came out. The second time was when the mediator asked him directly whether he'd intended to honor the trust as written before the beneficiary notice was filed. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked away and said he needed a moment with his attorney. We got a 15-minute break. I stood in the hallway outside the conference room and called Owen. He answered on the second ring. "How's it going?" he asked. "We're in a break. I think they're recalculating." "Good," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry I wasn't more present over the years. I knew something was off after he married Nadine. I just didn't want to deal with it." "You're dealing with it now," I said. "That matters." When we went back in, Grange made an offer. Not the full trust distribution, but a structured buyout at a valuation his client had apparently already commissioned. The number was below market, significantly. Petra countered, "I didn't speak during that part. I didn't need to." By 4 p.m, we had a preliminary agreement, full trust distribution as written, an independent valuation of all 4 restaurant locations, Nadine's removal from any operational role pending resolution of the fraud investigation, and a repayment schedule for the $83,000. My father signed the preliminary agreement without looking at me. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with finding out someone's love was conditional in ways you never knew to question. I'd known my father and I weren't close the way some fathers and daughters are. He'd been in my life, but not always present in it, if that makes sense. I'd always told myself that was just his personality, that some people expressed love through showing up consistently rather than effusively, and that what he showed up for was enough. Standing outside the mediation building, watching his car pull out of the parking lot without a word in my direction, I understood I'd been giving him more credit than he deserved. Petra walked out behind me. "The fraud referral goes to the DA's office next week," she said. "I want you prepared for that becoming public." "I know. How are you doing?" "I'm fine," I said, and then immediately, "Actually, I don't know. I'll probably know in a few days." She nodded like that was also the right answer. What happened next, I didn't engineer. I want to be clear about that. I was focused on the legal process, on getting the trust honored and the fraud addressed, on figuring out what I actually wanted my role at Callaway Kitchen to look like going forward. I wasn't thinking about movements or narratives or any of that. But Jonah had talked, the kitchen crew had talked, and it turned out that what had happened to Callaway Kitchen, a family business quietly looted while the person doing the actual work got pushed out, resonated with people. A local business reporter reached out to Petra's office. She asked if I'd be willing to speak on the record about the trust dispute. Not about the fraud, that was still under investigation, but about the trust and about what had happened to my role in the business over the previous 2 years. I said yes. The article ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been picked up by 2 regional outlets. Not because it was sensational, it wasn't particularly, but because the reporter had framed it around a specific question: what happens to the people who actually build a small business when ownership is treated as a private family transaction rather than a legal obligation? Other people started writing in: restaurant workers, adult children of small business owners, people who'd been quietly squeezed out of family enterprises they'd given years to. The reporter wrote a follow-up, then another. I got a call from a man named Theodore, who ran a small business advocacy nonprofit. He'd read the series and wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak at their annual conference about the trust and transparency issues. I said I'd think about it. I also got a voicemail from Vivian. I almost didn't listen to it. I let it sit for 2 days. When I finally played it, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. She said she hadn't known about the shell companies or the fake employees. She said she'd started the AGM job thinking it was an opportunity she'd earned, and that she'd recently started to understand that might not have been entirely true. She said she wasn't calling to ask for anything. She just thought I should know. I sat with that for a while. There was no version of this where Vivian was a villain. She was 23 and had been handed something by her mother that came at someone else's expense, and she was starting to reckon with that. The reckoning was hers to do. But I called her back and we talked for almost an hour, which I hadn't anticipated. "What are you going to do?" she asked near the end. "Keep the restaurants going," I said. "Try to do it right." "Do you want to?" I thought about Miguel and his pregnant wife. I thought about Jonah, who'd carried my boxes without asking questions. I thought about Rosie and her crossword puzzle, and 11 years of quiet competence. "Yeah," I said, "I do." The fraud investigation concluded the following spring. Nadine accepted a plea agreement. My father, whose attorney successfully argued his role had been primarily passive, he'd known or suspected and done nothing, which wasn't the same as initiating, avoided criminal charges but paid a civil fine and formally stepped down from all operational roles at Callaway Kitchen. At the formal ownership transfer, which Petra had arranged to happen at the flagship location rather than a lawyer's office, my father showed up alone. He stood near the back while the paperwork was signed. He didn't speak during the proceedings. When it was done and the staff had drifted back to their work, he found me by the front window. "I want you to know," he said, "that what your grandfather built mattered to me." "It matters to me too," I said. "That's why I'm here." He nodded. He looked at the room. The original counter stools, the framed menus on the wall from 1987, the photo of my grandfather in his apron that someone had moved from his office to the entryway. He looked at it for a moment. "He would have liked how you handled this," he said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. He left a few minutes later. I watched his car pull out through the window and then turned back to the room. Theodore's conference was in the fall. I'd said yes by then. I prepared 12 minutes of remarks about transparency and family business succession, about what it costs communities when small businesses are treated as private piggy banks rather than community institutions. The night before the conference, I sat in my apartment with my grandfather's original business plan, a photocopy I'd found in a filing cabinet during the ownership transfer, 5 pages written by hand on yellow legal paper, and read it front to back for the first time. He'd written, in the margins of the 3rd page, the point was never the money. The point was the place, the people who worked there, the neighborhood that grew up around it. I read that 3 times. The next morning, I stood at a podium in front of 200 small business owners and advocates, and I told the truth about what had happened and what it had cost and what it had been worth to fight for anyway. Afterward, a woman came up to me, mid-50s, running a bakery that had been in her family for 3 generations, and told me she'd been in a similar dispute with her siblings for 4 years and had been afraid to push back because she was afraid of losing the family. "Did you lose them?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Some of it," I said, "but what I kept turned out to be the part that was real." She nodded like she already knew that and just needed to hear someone else say it. I drove home through the city, past the downtown Callaway Kitchen location lit up on a Friday night, a line out the door, the way there'd been a line out the door since my grandfather opened it in 1987. The people inside didn't know any of what had happened in the past year. They just knew the food was good and the place felt like somewhere worth going. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. The thing I keep coming back to is the hallway. That 30 seconds of standing still with the coffee mug, deciding whether to keep walking or stay and listen. Most of the time we move through our lives making small choices like that without realizing how much weight they carry. I stayed. And because I stayed, everything that came after was possible. I don't think what happened to me was unusual. I think it happens quietly in families everywhere and small businesses and large ones. Someone does the work, someone else takes the credit, and the arrangement holds as long as nobody looks too closely. What made the difference in my situation wasn't luck. It was that I had the discipline to document before I acted, to call Brennan before I confronted anyone, to sit across from my father at the dinner table and not let my face betray anything while my mind was already 3 steps ahead. That kind of clear-headed thinking under pressure isn't something you're born with. It's something you build slowly through years of doing hard things carefully. Petra told me once that the clients who lose cases like mine are usually the ones who act on emotion before they have evidence. They confront too early, they threaten without leverage, they give the other side time to destroy documents and coordinate stories. I understood why, when you find out someone you trusted has been systematically taking from you, the anger is immediate and enormous. I felt it. But I'd learned somewhere along the way that the most effective thing you can do with that kind of anger is convert it into precision. Let it sharpen you instead of scatter you. And there's something else I've had to sit with, which is that none of this would have meant anything if I hadn't actually cared about the restaurants. About Miguel and his pregnant wife. About Jonah, who carried my boxes without asking questions. About Rosie and her crossword puzzle. If my only goal had been to win, to get what was legally mine and walk away, I could have done that. But what my grandfather wrote in those margins was true. The point was never the money, it was the place, the people. That's the part I couldn't abandon, even when abandoning it would have been easier. Not because someone told me I had to care, but because I genuinely did. And I've come to believe that caring about something beyond yourself, really caring, not performing it, is what gives you the stamina to keep going when the process is slow and expensive and the person you're fighting is someone you used to trust. My father signed those papers without looking at me. That still hurts sometimes. I think it will for a while. But I also know that what he lost wasn't taken from him by me. It was lost the moment he chose Nadine's scheme over his own daughter's future and decided not to tell me. The consequences followed from the choices. They always do. That's not punishment, it's just how things work. I stood at a podium in the fall and told the truth to 200 strangers. The bakery owner who came up to me afterward, the one who'd been in her own dispute for 4 years, asked if I'd lost my family over it. I told her I'd lost some of it, but what I kept turned out to be the part that was real. That's still true, and it still turns out to be enough.